At last, a voice for the people who pay big government bills, not the people who make big government bills. You are listening to Speaking of Taxpayers, sponsored by the 362,000-member National Taxpayers Union. I'm your co-host, Pete Sepp.
And I'm your co-host, Doug Kellogg.
Welcome to this week's broadcast.
Well, a week after State of the Union, Pete, and it's a little slower as a result of the aftermath of the president laying out his agenda for his budget this year. But big news breaking as the CBO announces up to or somewhere between 2.3 and 2.5 million jobs. Full-time jobs will be lost, cut down, changed, altered. It's a little nebulous exactly the range of effects that are contributing to this number. But that is a significant amount of people who have their employment status affected by Obamacare.
Yes, indeed. And once again, this was one of those things where everyone who supported the bill tried to put a bright, smiley face on top of it and said, no worries, no worries. Nobody's going to be affected in their choice of jobs or hours or employers' choices of jobs and hours by Obamacare, at least not significantly. CBO originally estimated it would be a 650,000 job effect. Now it's almost 4 times higher. Well, what do you know? The government underestimated the bad effects of one of its policies once again. And the interesting part of the CBO report that I saw was that the relative number of people getting shifted out of their jobs, deciding to leave them, will be concentrated among lower wage workers. Well, what do you know about that, too? Again, another selling point of the 2010 Affordable Health Care Act was to say, we're going to give coverage to the people who need it most. And somehow they must have left out the part that the people who need it most might also decide that working is no longer in their best interest, and those jobs will be gone or shifted to part-time, or the hours will be dramatically reduced, so the people who were at the lower end of the income scale will be making that much less money. Something's not adding up here.
Right, Pete. Well, there's been some interesting spin on this, as our listeners may have heard, with Harry Reid saying that Obamacare, as a result of this report, well, it will make people free agents. Nancy Pelosi sending out a press release saying this will help workers who are stuck in job lock, which is a term I've never heard before. And the New York Times actually might be most out front on this one, the editorial that said, Obamacare will free people, young and old, to pursue careers or retirement without having to worry about health coverage. Yes, there's a lot of spin going on from folks on the left about how this is a liberating experience for people, that they will have their hours cut down. Unfortunately, there might be a small percentage of people who are dying for this to happen. It's possible, but yes. A lot of these folks are going to have their hours cut down whether they like it or not. There are a lot of people who will never get in to these job situations because of the way this bill is structured. They'll never be able to lose their job or lose their hours. Definitely going to be some money out of folks' pockets.
Yeah, and I guess from all these remarks, we'll very soon see the introduction of legislation from these self-anointed guardians of health care for the middle class that would permit true portability of health care without tying it to a job, by allowing people to take the same kind of write-off on their individual tax return for their health insurance that people in the corporate sector deduct from their corporate profit tax returns. Not. And that is the biggest measure of hypocrisy right there. Well, you heard it from President Obama, folks. Even some members of Congress, the budget deficit has been cut in half, going way down. Problem with that, the Congressional Budget Office, which is a nonpartisan agency, has some very contradictory information to those claims. And here to sort them all out is the expert at our organization with National Taxpayers Union Foundation, Demian Brady. Welcome back to the program, sir.
Greetings, gentlemen. How are you?
Well, doing a little better after I heard the president's speech, thinking, gee whiz, we're making progress on deficit reduction. Then I read this thing and I see, maybe not. And what are some of the top line numbers that should have us worried here?
Well, the president was at least partially correct. He said that they've cut the deficit in half, and that was after the deficit was blown up to $1.4 trillion as of 2009. And the fiscal year that just finished, it was down to $770 billion. So that's close to half. But the CBO forecasts that it will continue to shrink for the next 2 years, even as a percentage of the economy. But then after that, this deficit is going to go back up to beyond levels where we've be much higher than the historical averages have been. And it's going to push debt up to the highest level in over 75 years that CBO has been tracking all this stuff.
Yeah, very disturbing figures. And of course, you know, these hiatuses, these pauses in deficit growth just keep getting shorter and shorter as the years go by. You know, I could recall back in the 1980s and 90s, there were predictions from both the Congressional Budget Office and the Office of Management and Budget saying, well, we can see a downward trend in the deficit perhaps beginning in the early 1990s, stretching out 10 years. Well, some of those were not proven correct because Congress just kept spending all the money. Maybe they were reading these reports too closely and said, hey, we've got room here. But at least in some of those, there were credible predictions that showed if Congress could keep the credit card in its pocket, if Congress could exercise a little restraint, maybe we would see not only a downward path of deficits, but actual surpluses. We even had that in the late 90s. Since then, it's been virtually all bad news. I mean, I don't see any credible government projection, haven't seen one for the better part of a decade projecting any kind of end to budget deficits.
Every time you hear a report that the federal government's budget is looking a little bit better, then Congress and the president, they aren't quite as concerned about it. We saw that last year when they already went and took back some of the spending cuts that they had only enacted 2 years previously. So it's not a surprise. We need to keep our members of Congress on their toes because they're all too quickly willing to backslide and let more spending in the budget. As you mentioned, all you need to do is be able to restrain the growth in spending from year to year, and the deficit problem would eventually shrink down, but they don't do that. And we see all too often also that they use budgetary gimmicks to cover up spending, big spending increases right now, paying for that over 5 or 10 years, and then when that time comes along, we might not necessarily see those savings because they're only on paper now. It's the one thing about these projections that we're talking about is it's just a guide. It's the government's economists' best guess based on spending under current law and how they project the economy to roll out over the next couple of years. So these things could change very, very easily. Much more spending could be added over the next couple of years. The economic projections might not be as good as even this report says, and the report forecast that after the next couple of years, they don't really expect growth to reach the historical levels that we've seen up to before this recession.
Yeah, this is interesting because, as you know, folks, federal spending tends to be broken down by the Congressional Budget Office into mandatory and discretionary. Mandatory being entitlement programs, Social Security, Medicare, Obamacare, certain farm programs. Discretionary being the things that Congress tends to appropriate money for on an annual basis through programs such as transportation projects or NASA, some education projects. Well, you take a look at the growth projections here. the discretionary category is expected to grow by an average of 1.3% a year for the next 10 years. But doesn't that assume, Demian, that spending caps will be back into place the way that Congress promised after breaking the promise they originally made on the caps and saying, well, just give us 2 more years without the original caps in place and we'll go back to those caps and obeying them?
Exactly. That's why you can't get too hung up on these long-term projections, especially based on these caps that we've already seen them roll back. It's much more likely that they're going to do this again in the future, and unless you get a good number of members in Congress, especially in the Senate, who are going to abide by these caps, but all too readily they overstep the caps, erase them, use budgetary gimmicks to get around them, come up with more savings in the future that will just be on paper. Now, I was just reading recently about the farm bill that was passed, and a lot of the cuts that were included in the bill aren't going to take place until 2018. So some people are concerned that these cuts that are just on paper, we might not necessarily see them. And then there's one commenter from a left-leaning group said, well, once CBO gets to 2018 and they try to roll back these spending cuts, we'll see that scored, but not necessarily, because they'll just shift the cuts for another 5 years down the road. So we'll just more cuts on paper, more spending going up.
Yeah, that's right. Now, in the mandatory category, which we just explained earlier, we're looking at an annualized increase of 5.7% a year on average. Now, I had thought that the federal government, especially President Obama, was just incredibly committed to bringing entitlement and mandatory spending under control. I thought that the Affordable Care Act of 2010 was supposed to do that. Well, okay, folks, I'm joking. I don't really think that. I'm just saying we were led to believe such a thing, and I don't know if these numbers quite reflect that kind of cost slowdown.
No, that's the biggest growing part of the budget are these mandatory programs. This is entitlement spending for Medicare, Medicaid, and the new entitlement program to provide subsidies through the healthcare exchanges to purchase healthcare via Obamacare. This is going to be one of the biggest growing parts of the budget, and the reason why we have the deficits being projected going back up again to near record levels is because that the spending is outpacing the growth in revenues that CBO is forecasting. CBO looked at the economy and saw that tax receipts will grow by about 9% this year and grow pretty well again the next year. But then after that, they expect that the economy will slow down a little bit more, and then we're going to see more entitlement spending. And we'll see about average receipts growing by 5%, but total spending will grow by 5.4% over the next several years. So that's why we have the deficits, too much spending.
Well, one interesting related point on deficits that I wanted to cover before we wrap this up, the fact that deficits themselves are going to feed back into the spending loop owing to the fact that we're borrowing money that's costing us interest every year, and those payments are going to go way up under these projections. I mean, I'm reading here in 2017, the percentage growth in debt interest payments will be 24% versus the previous year. You average it out over the decade-long period, 13.6% annual growth in interest payments. That's where the rubber meets the road when it comes to ballooning the federal budget. Just one change in interest rates and they are going to go up according to CBO, and suddenly it costs a whole lot more to borrow money.
And they're not just growing in dollars. It's also, these payments will also be growing as a percentage of the economy. Right now, it's taking up about 1.3% in GDP for our net interest payments. That will grow to over 3% in the next 10 years. And who knows what could happen if interest rates in general go up. These costs could grow significantly from what is already being forecast.
Yikes. Well, to learn more about this and other vital issues, where would you recommend people look, Demian?
come to our website, ntu.org, and subscribe to our newsletter, the Taxpayers tab, to get all the latest about what's going on in Congress with your money.
Thank you so much for being with us, sir.
Thanks, guys.
Well, now joining us in studio is NTU State Affairs Manager Lee Schalk. We have a lot going on in the state level, as usual. And this week's all-star from the state level, at least in terms of the level of activity, is Virginia. So, Lee, start us off. We have one particularly unique issue where the option, an additional option for how people receive their tax refund is on the line.
Yeah, there are a couple key pieces of legislation in Richmond right now relating to state income tax refunds, and those are SB 27 and HB 440. Now, the reason why we think taxpayers should pay attention here are that the way that these proposals stand right now, they've been amended to strip an important method of receiving your state income tax refund, and that is the prepaid debit card. So there are two causes of concern here for taxpayers. Without the option of a prepaid debit card, some taxpayers may not be able to select the option that's most convenient for them. And two, without the option of the prepaid debit card, we're missing a key opportunity to save the state tax dollars by lowering the use of paper refund checks.
Yeah, that seems like a no-brainer. I mean, granted, you don't necessarily want to throw people into one way only, but why in the world eliminate that option when it was available before, when it's proven to save money in lots of other capacities for the delivery of various state benefits? It's been a money saver for the federal government and other states besides Virginia, and it's hard to understand what the level of thinking was here in the legislature. I guess they're saying, well, we know best. We're going to be all patrimonial about it and not allow people to choose their method of refund the way they want. We're just going to condemn them to a couple of choices and end up costing taxpayers anyway in the end. This is their own money, for crying out loud. They should be able to decide how they get it back.
And in recent times, the prepaid debit card option has come under a little bit of fire because folks criticize it for carrying fees when Virginians would go to use them. But actually, these fees are very much avoidable. And for Virginians, especially who are unbanked, and that might be the best option for them, they can take that debit card and cash it just like a check at any bank without a fee. Now, if you're unbanked and you go to cash a check somewhere, that'll carry a pretty hefty fee. So we want to make sure that folks are able to get back their entire refund because, like Pete mentioned, these are your tax dollars.
Yeah, and this legislation actually had to be proactively amended to strip out the option, so that's a double insult to the taxpayers of Virginia. Here's hoping those two bills, as they are written at least, go down to defeat. And now we have another problem in Virginia. What is it there? This used to be a fiscally conservative state. We're always fighting these bad proposals. This one has to do with Medicaid now.
Yeah, a lot of Republicans, well, I shouldn't say a lot, but a handful of Republicans in the Virginia Senate are joining, it seems, with Terry McAuliffe in the call to expand Medicaid. Now, a pair of Virginia senators have introduced what's essentially Medicaid expansion light, or Obamacare light. And this is probably a big relief to Governor McAuliffe, who's been penning op-eds and grandstanding to expand Medicaid. Now, Medicaid expansion, as you know, is one of the three legs of the stool that is Obamacare, and the others being healthcare.gov and the government insurance plans, the employers' insurance plans.
Yes.
Now, this Virginia Medicaid expansion light plan, as the Virginia Senate has introduced it, is essentially like the Arkansas private option that I recently touched on this podcast. The problem here is that we really don't want to see states take any form of federal dollars or any amount of federal dollars because it puts them on the hook for Medicaid and it really makes them a co-owner of the president's health care law. And really, I agree with the House of Delegates, the Republicans in the House of Delegates in Virginia on this. There's no rush to expand Medicaid. Why not make sure that Medicaid isn't wasteful? Let's audit the program and eliminate waste before we even consider adding more people to the rolls.
Yeah, a very sensible approach. And speaking of sensible approaches here on Speaking of Taxpayers, at least there's one good piece of news coming out of Virginia. That is the introduction and floor action on a resolution that calls upon the federal government to pass a balanced budget amendment, or, in the absence of that, have a convention of the states for the sole and exclusive purpose of drafting such an amendment for ratification. Well, bad news along with the good news, it has failed on its first vote, but we do have another vote coming up in the House of Delegates where we just might win it.
That's right. Delegate Jim LeMunyon has introduced this legislation, and if we could get it passed in Virginia, it would make the Commonwealth the 21st state to pass the Article 5 BBA resolution.
Yes, and we need 34 states in order to convene this limited assembly for drafting an amendment. So each state we can add to the pile is that much more progress, and we just learned that a key Senate committee in the state of South Dakota has given the okay to a balanced budget amendment resolution. So that means we just may see floor action in the upper chamber in that state. Now, moving back east from South Dakota and a little south of South Dakota, we're talking about North Carolina and some interesting results of the unemployment policies there.
Yeah, the Tar Heel state let 73 weeks of unemployment benefits expire in July, and many on the left were saying that, we're going to see the jobless rate skyrocket. But actually, the jobless rate in North Carolina fell to 6.9%, down from 8.9% in July. Now, that is, a very interesting contrast to the rest of the country, where the decline in the national rate was from 7.3% to 6.7%. So a much bigger drop in the unemployment rate.
Yeah, so we don't know necessarily the causes here, whether it was just more people motivated to look for jobs, an upswing in conditions among some particular industries, but one thing seems pretty clear here, that catastrophe has not essentially befallen the Tar Heel state yet. And appropriately enough, the Keystone State is key to the spread of many good or bad fiscal policies owing to its size, and we have some new budget proposals in Pennsylvania, do we not?
We do, and the governor in Pennsylvania recently unveiled his very lengthy budget proposal, more than 1,000 pages.
Wow.
But there was some good and bad in there. One of the good things was that the governor is still talking about liquor privatization, and that's something that National Taxpayers Union focused heavily on the last year, trying to get the government out of the liquor business. And the governor is now calling on the Senate to act this year.
Okay, so the House has already passed the bill. We need the upper chamber to act. Then
Correct.
It becomes law, and presumably by getting government out of that line of business, we allow greater consumer choice. These businesses that take it over in the private sector begin paying taxes, and everybody benefits.
It's a win-win for everybody in the state. Another good piece of the budget proposal was the governor's call for pension reform this session. And like we've seen across the country, many states, many localities are suffering due to unfunded pension liabilities. In Pennsylvania, that currently stands at $47 billion, and that's just going to drive up taxes at the state and local levels. You'll probably also see in Pennsylvania property taxes increasing to cover this if it's not addressed.
So we do have a downside, though, to some of these proposals as well.
Correct. Unfortunately, the budget proposal increases total spending in the state to $71.8 billion and the general fund to $29.4 billion. Both of these would be all-time highs for Pennsylvania, and that's a 6% increase in total spending from 2013 and 2014.
Wow. So we'll have to kind of accentuate the positive and eliminate the negative when it comes to this budget proposal.
That's right.
Well, thanks so much for joining us, Lee. Keep hard at it. We know that you're out there fighting for taxpayers every day, every way, no matter where the fight is. Thanks for being there for us.
Thanks, Pete.
It's time for the outrage of the week. This week's outrage from the Washington Free Beacon's Lachlan Markey, writing about how Medicaid overspent by $62 million on diapers and some other things that might be related to that category. So it might not all literally be diapers, but wow, that's a lot of money. Although this is a bit of a disturbing topic, we will have to let Pete delve into it for us.
Yes, under the Medicaid program, of course, there is coverage and money available for home health services for those patients who might be under nursing care, and those services can include incontinence supplies, both for adults and children. That accounted for $266 million of Medicaid spending in the year 2012 alone, which is testament to just how big the Medicaid program is, that one little item like this can add up to a couple $100 million, even more than that. But the report by the Inspector General of the Department of Health and Human Services, on which this article is based, pointed out that very few state agencies, and this is a joint state-federal program with Medicaid, actually have competitive bidding processes to give these supplies to Medicaid patients. As a result, a lot of agencies are overpaying for the supplies. In fact, according to this report, there are only 5 agencies in the entire country at the state level that have implemented competitive bidding programs for this type of commodity. Well, obviously, then you're going to have a very serious overspending problem. Like you said, 23% extra spending that didn't have to occur under this taxpayer-funded program, amounting to about $62 million. There may also, of course, be problems with fraudulent activities. That's widespread in the Medicaid program, regardless of what kind of service you're talking about. But when it comes to incontinence supplies in particular, the Justice Department recently charged husband and wife owners of a practice in Texas, which filed about $2 million worth of fraudulent incontinence supply claims with Medicaid. Oh my goodness, here's another one. A Maryland medical equipment company's owner pled guilty to submitting false reimbursement claims for over $212,000 of incontinence supplies. This is obviously apart from the whole competitive bidding issue, so we have several problems here going on at once. And regardless of the product or the service being offered, Doug, I think a main source of the problem here is that this is a third-party system. You're talking about not only 2 different levels of government trying to coordinate the service, but a lot of private providers billing the government and not enough oversight going on through the transactions.
Well, we've had a lot of these types of outrages in the past. And it's unfortunately because of those reasons that Pete just outlined. You're dealing with a system that is really open to fraud and abuse. You have a reporting system where things will just go through, and whether it's just people not putting in the hours in the government side to keep up with scrutinizing what's happening with these orders, or what exactly the problem is, there are probably multiple things that contribute to it. They're not doing a good enough job, and that's why these things continue to happen. Whether it's diapers or random supplies, sometimes it's something really tiny that somebody sneaks through, but just in volume, and gets a lot of money out of the government by jacking up the price of that thing. It's really open to abuse, and it's unfortunate that this keeps happening, and we don't see a commitment from the government side, because this is money wasted. There is no constituent that is losing out because of this, if we get rid of this waste and save taxpayers money here. So when that will happen, I don't know. But it might have to involve a little less job security for federal workers, a little more competition on their side, and a little more of a oversight from Congress and others, some kind of body to make sure that folks are doing their job.
Well, and until we see that oversight, things like these will be the outrage of the week. That about does it for this edition of Speaking of Taxpayers. Remember, folks, you have the power to fight the power if you speak truth to power. And we speak truth to power every week here on Speaking of Taxpayers. I'm your co-host, Pete Sepp.
And I'm your co-host, Doug Kellogg.
So long.